Who else came in? Mallory came in. All right, what I thought we would do to start off today is just go over the cranial nerves one more time, just because repetition sort of never hurts on that kind of thing. All right, so we label the cranial nerves by Roman numerals. Let's try this again. All right, so we label the cranial nerves by Roman numerals, and they get their Roman numerals by where they come out of the brainstem. So, in other words, cranial nerve 1 comes off anteriorly and superiorly, because it comes off way in the front of the brain, just underneath the frontal lobes. And then from there, each cranial nerve comes out a little lower, going from anterior and superior to posterior and inferior. So it sort of goes like this as you go down. So we have 2, which is right here. 3 kind of peeks out between the pons and the midbrain. 4 is off to the side, and in a lot of, like in our brains that we have in the lab, you can't find 4 because it's such a tiny little nerve that it gets broken. 5 comes out right in the midst of the transverse fibers of the pons, so it's sort of easy to identify. It's also one of the largest of the cranial nerves. The optic nerve is the largest, but the cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal, is probably the next one down in terms of size. 6, 7, so here's 6, 7, 8 kind of come out between the pons and the medulla, and then 9, 10, 11, and 12 all come out of the medulla oblongata. So let's just review. All right, so the cranial nerve number 1, which sits below the frontal lobe. So this is the frontal lobe of the brain here, of the cerebrum. Here's the nasal cavity. At the top of the nasal cavity is the olfactory epithelium, which we're going to learn about when we get to the special senses chapter. But the nerve supplying that is cranial nerve 1, olfactory. Olfactory just means smell. Number 2 is optic. There's an optic nerve that comes from each eye. They join together at this kind of X called the optic chiasm. And then from there, it splits into fibers that go to the left side and fibers that go to the right side. So we call these the optic tract. These are the optic nerves. So cranial nerve number 2 is here, and that's the optic nerves. All right. 3, 4, and 6 all control muscles of the eye. You know, the eye has a lot of different ways it can move. It has 6 muscles associated with it. So 3 of those muscles are controlled by the oculomotor nerve. And then the remaining muscles are the trochlear, number 4, and the abducens, which controls the outside rectus muscle, allows you to turn your eye outward, and that's number 6. The trigeminal is number 5. This is a sensory nerve. So, well, it's okay. It provides the sensation to the face, but it provides the motor to the muscles of mastication. So don't get the trigeminal and facial nerve confused. The trigeminal brings in skin sensation from the face, but it doesn't control the muscles of the face. That's the facial nerve number 7. The muscles it does control are the deeper muscles that control the jaw and create chewing. So that's number 5. Number 7, the facial nerve innervates all of those muscles of facial expression. So it makes the face move, essentially. Number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So this comes from the ear, from the inner ear. So this includes both hearing information from the cochlea and then equilibrium information from the vestibular apparatus, so the semicircular canals and those things that we'll cover later. All right. So in all of these pictures, there's a lot of anatomy. All I want you to know is the name of the nerve and what it does. Okay, so you don't have to tell me, that it has 3 branches or that it goes through this hole or that hole. Don't care about that. Just want you to know the cranial nerves and what they do. All right. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal. So this is sensory and motor. muscles to the tongue and some of the underlying muscles at the bottom of the mouth. The vagus nerve is super important because it controls the parasympathetic innervation to all of the viscera. So beginning on Wednesday, we're going to start talking about the autonomic nervous system, and we're going to see just how important the vagus nerve is because it controls things like digestion and heart rate and things like that. So you can see that there are lots of targets, and that's the vagus nerve, number 10. All right. Number 11 controls a couple of muscles that control the head. You know, the head has to be positioned correctly for us to do what we're trying to do, and mostly that's the sternocleidomastoid in the front and the trapezius in the back that control the position of the head. And then the hypoglossal, number 12, controls basically the bottom part of the tongue and the muscles that lie just underneath it. All right. So mnemonics, I'm sure you found more memorable ones than this one by now, but that's the one nice clean one that I found. All right. So a little review on that.
So what's the difference between the glossal pharyngeal
and the hypoglossal? The muscles that they innervate are different, but you don't need to know that. You can kind of think of them as the same. They both innervate the tongue and pharynx. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so the rest of this chapter is all about pathways. You know, we have talked now about the spinal cord, and we have talked about the brain. So now we need to see how those two things are connected together. You know, the information from the brain has to get down into the body, and all the information from the skin senses has to get up to the brain. So we have a number of different sensory pathways. And while this information may seem complex, it's not trivial. You hear a lot about these pathways, motor and sensory pathways, in dealing with patients who have had any kind of neurologic injury. So that spinal cord injury, you know, from things like trauma, gunshots, car accidents, things like that. But also stroke-type injury, you know, cerebrovascular accident, where some part of the brain or spinal cord has died because of a lack of blood flow. So we don't go into a lot of detail here, but these pathways do help us understand what to expect from a patient who has had a neurologic injury of some kind. Because if we know what's damaged, we can predict what will come back and what their problems are going to be. All right, so we start off with the sensory pathways. These are pathways that are going to carry information from the skin up to the brain, up to the various parts of the brain that receive information about the outside world. So the spinothalamic pathway, thankfully these are all named sort of intelligently. Spino is spine, thalamic is thalamus. So this is a pathway that's going from the spinal cord to the thalamus. So this is carrying information, not surprisingly, up to the thalamus. And then the thalamus, you remember, transmits some information up to the sensory cortex, and some information it dumps, it doesn't transfer. Because the thalamus's job is to effectively control what we're aware of. So we don't have to be aware of all the stimuli that are present, you know, in our bodies all the time. The thalamus controls and just sends the important stuff, so to speak. So the spinothalamic pathway there's two places in the spinal cord it exists. There's an anterior and a lateral, and I'll show you a picture in a minute. The anterior spinothalamic pathway carries what we call crude touch. So what is that? This is touch that you might describe as simply pressure. It's not very localized. In other words, you might be able to say, that was on my hand, but you wouldn't be able to tell anything about it. You know, was it a hard touch, a soft touch? Was it a big object, a small object? Crude touch doesn't transmit that information. That comes through what we call fine touch. So in the anterior spinothalamic pathway, we have crude touch and pressure. And then on the lateral one, pain and temperature. Again, these are not as localized and not as detailed as the fine touch versions. So, you know, pain and temperature don't usually happen in just one spot. They happen in an area of skin. So the spinothalamic pathways, the information they contain, is not very precise, but it is very important. All right, so that's one sensory pathway. The posterior columns, or the posterior column pathway, carries probably the most significant information from the body up to the brain. So this is things like fine touch, the kind of touch that you're consciously aware of most of the time, where you can tell in very great detail. If I put something rough in your hand, you wouldn't even have to move it, and you can still tell that it was rough. That's fine touch. Pressure, again, vibration. We have specialized senses in the skin that detect vibration, probably so that we can identify things in our surroundings more easily. All right. Proprioception, that's, remember, the position of the joints, body position. So those all go through the posterior columns. And then the spino-cerebellar, spine to cerebellum pathway, this just contains proprioceptive information. Remember, the cerebellum's job, or one of its jobs, is to coordinate the muscle activity of the body so that the things we do very smoothly and very precisely. In order to do that, it needs information about what's going on. So it has its own sensory pathway that brings in proprioceptive information from the brain. All right, so here are those three pathways. The spinothalamic paths, so we have from spinal cord to thalamus. So here's the thalamus right here. And we have an anterior and a lateral. And you can see that the anterior tract is in the front part of the spinal cord. See it there? And the lateral tract is off to the side of the butterfly, so to speak. So we have these two tracts. And then important in each of these pathways that we're going to talk about today is to know where the nerves cross. We all have learned from high school that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and vice versa, right? Well, that means that at some point the nerves have to go from one side to the other. And in these different pathways, the point of crossing is different. All right, so if we look down here, here's a level of spinal cord. And, here's our dorsal root ganglion, here's our ventral root. So this is sensory information, right? So it's going to come in through the dorsal root ganglion. We talked about that when we talked about the spinal cord. So it's going to synapse here, and then you can see this white neuron right here. The spinothalamic paths cross in the spinal cord at the level of the spinal nerve. So information from the left side comes in and immediately crosses to the right side, and then it goes up on the right side to the right side of the thalamus. So here, these cross in the spinal cord, and you could even add at the level of the where they come in. So in the anterior we have that, and here in the lateral we have that too. Information comes in, crosses, and then goes up to the thalamus on the opposite side. All right. For the posterior columns, the information, they're here in the back. They get their name because they are posterior, and they are rather column-like. And the reason for that is this is a huge bundle of axons of neurons, because all of the fine touch information from the body is passing through these long tracts. So when you dissect the spinal cord, you find these columns. They don't like to give way, so we call them the posterior columns. All right, so here information comes in. It goes up on the same side, so it hasn't crossed yet. Here's the midline. So this information is going up on the same side. And then in the brain stem, there's a crossing over called a decussation. So for the posterior column pathways, the information crosses in the brain stem. This whole left column, left column, I think that's left, no, that's right. The right column goes over to the left side, and the left column goes over to the right side. So the crossing is in the brainstem. All right. And then for the spinocerebellar pathway, here the pattern's a little different. We have, instead of having the left side of the brain controlling the right side and vice versa, here both sides of the brain are involved. And this sort of makes sense. In order to do things in a nice, balanced way, coordinated way, the left side and right side have to share a great deal of information, right? If the left side of the brain and right side of the brain didn't talk to each other, we would never be able to walk smoothly because we'd have a tendency to fall to one side or the other. So for the spinocerebellar pathway, the information, some of the information crosses and some of it does not. So we have a mixing of the left and right-sided information. So if we look, we have information coming in from the left side and the right side. And then we have neurons that go up on the same side, like right here. And we have neurons that cross the midline and go up on the other side, like here. So some information crosses and some information does not. All right. So the key thing to know about these pathways is their general location in the spinal cord, where they cross, and the kind of information that they carry. That's what I'm looking for you to know. All right, so those are the ascending tracts, or the sensory tracts, carrying information into the nervous system from the different senses that the body has. Coming out of the brain, well, we need to have information to control muscles. So we have, again, three pathways that we call descending tracts. One is the corticospinal tract. Cortico is cortex. So this is coming from the cortex, specifically from the motor cortex, which, remember, we find in that precentral gyrus. So at the back of the frontal lobe, we have this gyrus that has all of the motor commands, all the neurons that direct muscle action. So from that region of cortex, this tract carries information down into the spinal cord and eventually to the lower motor neurons in the ventral horns, which I'll show you in a minute. So that's the corticospinal tract. This is what carries conscious motor control information. So a disease or a problem with the corticospinal tract results in paralysis because without stimulation, muscles don't contract. And all of those signals for stimulation are going to come through this corticospinal tract. So just like the posterior columns are probably the most important of the ascending tracts, the corticospinal tract is probably the most important of the descending because it's carrying conscious motor control. That is what's most important to us, right, in what we do on a regular basis. All right, and then the medial and lateral pathways carry subconscious motor control. Now, it's still important, but this is the motor control that provides things like posture or limb positioning. You know, it doesn't carry the information about what you're doing on purpose. It carries the information about what the rest of your body needs to be doing for you to be doing that on purpose. You know, so for example, if you're going to throw a ball, you have to stabilize your trunk and you have to stabilize your shoulder. Now, nobody thinks about that. We just think about throwing the ball. So the throwing the ball part comes through the corticospinal tract. All of the posture and position stuff comes through the medial and lateral pathways. All right. So where is the corticospinal tract? Well, it is just in front and off to the side of the posterior horn here. Here's the posterior horn. So here is the lateral corticospinal tract. And here again, important to know where they cross. The corticospinal tract, just like the posterior columns, crosses in the brainstem. So we have information from the right side of the brain that comes down here, crosses over, and then goes down the left side of the spinal cord to the left side of the body to control the left-sided muscles. All right. So it's carrying voluntary motor commands. In the motor system, we frequently talk about upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. So let's talk about the last one first. Lower motor neurons are the neurons that actually go out to the muscles. You know, so in the gray matter of the spinal cord, we have the cell bodies of the neurons whose axons go all the way out to the muscle to that neuromuscular junction, right? So what triggers muscle activity? The action of these lower motor neurons. But they don't work in isolation. They are controlled by the upper motor neurons, whose cell bodies are in the cortex of the frontal lobe, and then whose axons go down this corticospinal tract to synapse on the lower motor neurons. So there's sort of two steps in the chain. The upper motor neurons decide what to do, and then the lower motor neurons actually make it happen at the muscle. They actually trigger muscle contraction. So we have upper and lower. Now, why is that important? When you get into the study of disease, you're going to find that a different set of illnesses affect the upper motor neurons than the lower motor neurons, and the symptoms are different. So for now, just know that you have this two-part chain, and then later, other folks will fill in why that's important. All right. But the upper motor neuron axons pass through the corticospinal tract, the lateral corticospinal tract. So here they cross, they go down, and then synapse on lower motor neurons. All right. And then we have the last two descending pathways, the medial and lateral pathways. So here we have the medial, and you can see that it's very medial. You know, we have the corticospinal tract here and here, and then next to it, we have these three tracts, the reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and tectospinal. Now, I don't want you to memorize those. I just want you to know that there's a group of tracts right here called the medial pathways, and that there's a tract out here called the lateral pathway. And all of these can bring subconscious control of muscles. There is some precision movement to the fingers particularly that also pass through these the lateral pathways, but not important for you to know that right now. All right, so medial and lateral pathways. So what we see in the brain always is multiple levels of control. You know, the brain can do very fancy, very amazingly intelligent things, but it also does very simple things very reliably. So, for example, you know, when we start at the brainstem, you know, all that's happening there is the very simplest of reflex control. You know, nothing fancy goes on in the brainstem, but the things that go on in the brainstem are critical for everything else. You know, the heart needs to be beating and we need to be breathing in order for anything else to really happen. As we go a little further up, the pons and the medulla control reflexes, and they balance those reflexes. They don't just respond to things, they keep things the way they're supposed to. So we have a little bit more of an elegant control in the pons and the medulla. All right. In the hypothalamus, we start getting into the motivations for actions. You know, why do we do the things we do? It's because we have needs, right? You know, in order to stay alive. So the hypothalamus is kind of responsible for beginning the process of meeting those needs, whether it be food, water, shelter, you know, space, any of those things. So that's the hypothalamus. The thalamus and the midbrain really control stimuli. What gets up into consciousness and what doesn't. So a problem in the thalamus can leave a person unaware because no stimuli are being transmitted, or hyper-aware, where all stimuli are being transmitted and it's a flood or it's overwhelming. All right. The basal nuclei, we talked briefly about. They help to control repetitive motions, you know, things like walking and patterns of thought, basically, at the subconscious level. And then we get all the way up to the cerebral cortex, and this is where we get, you know, what we typically think of as human thought or behavior. So planning, coordination, you know, rational thinking, even things like imagination and creativity, all those things are happening at the cerebral cortex level. And then in some ways, the cerebellum doesn't exactly fit into this scheme because the cerebellum works between a lot of these different parts of the brain. So the cerebellum is all about coordination, not control. So it's coordinating things and managing things, but it's not making decisions. And then, like we talked about, the cerebellum can also play back commonly done actions like driving the car or signing your name or things like that. So we have multiple levels of control of things. All right. So planning and doing are two words that are commonly associated with what the cerebral part of the brain does, the frontal lobe. Because we have to do both things. In other words, we have to plan what we're going to do, and that means at some level, you know, the muscle or the nerves of the brain have to control every single muscle in an action. So if you think about signing your name, you know, you've learned some of the muscles of the forearm, right? You can imagine that signals have to be sent to all those muscles of the forearm, even to do something as simple as sign your name. So the planning is creating the program that the muscles are going to run. And then the doing is actually getting them to do that according to the original program. So just to give you some examples, you know, you make a decision to do something. It's the motor association areas and the basal nuclei that then turn that planning into actually doing. And then once you start doing something, the way the body works is we don't work like robots, you know, where the brain creates a program and then that program runs out in the muscles. It isn't like that. Every time all the while we're doing something, the brain is watching what we're doing and seeing if it matches what it expects. So there's kind of this constant feedback loop that controls what we're doing while we're doing it. So just a little hint of just how complicated brain physiology can get is some of these ideas, because it's half idea, half physiology, which is why we don't talk very much about it. All right, let's do a couple of questions, and then we'll call it an early day. Okay, the ability to localize the position of body parts is called which of those things? And I'll send it to you in just a second. There we go. All right, jump in there if you want. All right, and that is proprioception. You know, we all learned that we had 5 senses. This is one that should probably be included in that list, but isn't, because it's not really touch. Proprioception is the ability to know where our body parts are, which seems kind of silly. Why would you need to know that? But all of the things that we do with our muscles and bones, we wouldn't be able to do if it wasn't for proprioception. So, you know, one of the reasons that our body can do things not like a robot does is because it always knows where its parts are. You know, it knows the position of everything. All right. And let's see. Okay. Which of the following is an ascending pathway in the spinal cord? All right, jump in there. All right, we talked about 3 ascending pathways and 3 descending pathways. So an ascending pathway is going to be carrying sensory information to the brain. So that's your lateral spinal thalamic tract. It's also the posterior columns. These others, the rubrospinal, lateral cortico, and anterior cortico, those are all descending paths, carrying motor information from the brain out to the muscles. All right. Which of the following is a descending pathway? right, everybody's answered already. That one must have been easier. So that's B, the corticospinal tract. Those others are ascending pathways. So know the descending ones, know the ascending ones, what they carry, and then where they cross. That's another thing I want you to know is where the information crosses. Okay, that's it for today. The next chapter, which is autonomic nervous system, I consider to be one of the most important chapters of this whole first part of the A&P. So I know we're getting towards the end of the break and all that, but I want you to be ready to think and learn about this autonomic nervous system stuff, because if you learn it right now, you'll have a lot easier time when you get to things like medications and the diseases that affect this system. And we'll talk more about that, but be on your A game for this next chapter, please. All right, thank you, everybody.